Look, there's a lot going on. We mentioned that case in Georgia just a moment ago, the judge saying, hey, mandatory hand counting of the ballots. And he essentially threw out all of these different tactics that were being used by the GOP to gum up the works in Georgia. You may have a thought on that. I don't know if you do. And then I can get to some of the other,
I do. I thought the ruling was very judicious because he said, look, I don't need to really get to the merits of this at this point, but you did it so late. It's going to really monkey with the election. It's going to be too hard to deal with at the election coming up in 3 weeks. So I'm going to think about it some more, and the appellate court can think about it if it wants to. But my ruling right now is that this will not go into effect, either the hand count or this so-called reasonable inquiry. He also made a ruling in the reasonable inquiry. The hand count is that you don't have to hand count. The idea was that you would open up these ballots, these results, sealed results that are done by the computer, that are done all the ways that have been proven to be proper. And then you would open them up by hand in 5,000 different precincts throughout Georgia, and you would hand count them, besides being very time consuming. As even Raffensperger said, remember, he's the elections chief down there, the one who stood up to Trump. He said, this is a prescription for fraud, delay, a mess. The other ruling that the judge made was the reasonable inquiry, also made by that same board that's in power. It has 3 Trump members out of its 5 marked down there. And those 3 decided that they could, on their own, in their own discretion, the board, do a reasonable inquiry as to whether there had been fraud, whether there'd been some problem. And everyone said, oh, we get it. In the name of preventing fraud, they're going to actually commit fraud, delay, and putting a pro-Trump finger on the scale, because if the results came in Trump's way, that would be great. But if they were coming in not Trump's way, there would need to be a reasonable inquiry. And that would produce this real Pandora's box, Mark, because then they wouldn't certify within the week which they have to certify. The whole state couldn't certify because all these precincts were lagging behind doing their so-called reasonable inquiry, which wasn't even defined in the statute. And then Georgia would just not report its results. Imagine if the state was leaning toward Harris. The other states were very close. With Georgia went the election, and then Georgia was not reporting because of these 3 people controlling this 5-person board. They would delay it. Instead of seeing on Associated Press, Harris wins, delays, count, big mess. Maybe Congress has to get involved. So the judge, I think, absolutely did the right thing. Just to finish the point, they can appeal at this point to the Court of Appeal down there in Georgia. But it seems like this is the end of this ride before the election, and they will not be able to monkey with the vote down there in Georgia. Very last thing, there was a record turnout the first day that they could actually vote, by mail. There was an enormous record-breaking vote by mail. You figure it's probably because there's huge turnout. It's for Harris, and the most beautiful vote of all of them was Jimmy Carter's.
Yeah, indeed. He said he wanted to live to vote for Harris this time around at age 100. Just to put a point on that, this strategy of monkeying with things such that you slow them down and you just throw sand into the gears of the vote and the election, that is the GOP strategy now in key swing states particularly, so that you can't reach the Electoral College threshold and neither candidate will have it. And in that way, there's a chaos about who's won the election, and then it goes and is thrown ultimately to Congress, which is overwhelmingly, because it's just one vote per state, favoring GOP, and then Trump ascends to the presidency. That's the strategy. It may feel like a long shot, since it certainly doesn't have a lot of historical precedent in past elections, but it is the articulated strategy on some level. Now, yeah, please
Mark,
go ahead.
It's also in the Constitution, and it would end up going to the House, and they would vote by state delegations, and there are 26, 27, whatever it is. Although there are, even if the Congress went Democratic, now maybe they could cure that if it goes Democratic before January 6th. But the problem is that if they vote by state delegations, there are, let's say, 27 or 28 that are Republican. And that's not by population. That's the same way we got into this problem with the Senate, which is so unrepresentative, where we have the Senate that's, 2 votes for every state. And so Wyoming has the same 2 votes that California has. And one last thing, Mark, civic pride and a sense of patriotism always prevented this problem. No matter whether you're a Republican or Democrat, you would say, you know what? We'll get them next time. We're going to count the vote. We're responsible people. All of these folks who volunteer to be poll watchers, they're not trying to put their finger on the scale. They're doing their civic duty. This is patriotism. This is what America is all about. And, we've always had this feeling that if the other side wins, we'll get him next time, until Trump came along.
Well, and just to double back to something you just said, it wouldn't matter who controls Congress, the House, that is to say, because it just goes to the states, as you say. It goes one state, one vote. So it wouldn't matter. Republicans in control, Democrats in control. Wouldn't it that be the case?
I think that's right. Although there is some hope that if it went Democratic, that, they figure Speaker Johnson, if he remains Speaker, has already shown that he doesn't have an inclination to make sure that there's a fair, proper. Every time you ask him, will you count? He answers this, well, yes, if it's fair, which of course is another way of saying, if I like the results.
Sure.
So
sure.
I think there'd be less mischief if the Democrats were in control of the House on January 6th. I just somehow think there'd be less mischief.
Just as a digression, one of the great things I saw over the weekend was that Johnson that you're talking about, Mike Johnson, who is I get it, he kind of looks like a Tim Kazurinsky in SNL from years ago. He's got that very kind of sort of nerdy, like this guy wouldn't be a by the books guy. He's a horrible guy. Okay, he's an alt-right radical election denier who fought tenaciously for Donald Trump, even as Donald Trump had lost the election, and he continues to pursue that election lie. Okay, that's who he is. But on the Kamala Harris medical records, she released her medical records, and Trump, of course, has not released his medical records, hasn't released his college transcript, hasn't released anything, right? But on the medical records, he was going after Kamala Harris because she has some skin condition or something. It's an allergy. It was a long explanation of what really is an allergy, okay? And he was going after it like it could be distracting. She's not going to be able to focus on the work or whatever. It was just total BS. And when asked by the moderator, well, what about Donald Trump? He hasn't released his records. And Harris's view was, what are you talking about? His records are on display every day. You can see how vital a man he is. It was like, wow. This is the tortured logic of the GOP in this case and of Mike Johnson. Just a despicable guy.
Mark, just one last thing, because people either don't remember or don't want to remember all of the foibles and mess ups of the Trump years. But one of the hilarious ones was when he was the greatest health of anyone in America. And he double parked his limousine, I think, ran up to the doctor's office, right? Got a letter from the doctor that he was in great shape and was back in his double parked car within about 10 minutes. And then it turned out that there was some crooked connection with that doctor. It was beyond belief. Allegedly.
Right.
Allegedly, there was a crooked connection with that doctor.
Oh, it's so funny. It was hay fever and occasional hives. Thank you, Teacher Lori. That's exactly what it was. All right. Before I move on, David Katz, I know you wanted to talk about this renewed interest in the Menendez case, and I didn't want our time to completely expire without at least getting to it, so let's get to it early. So Lyle and Eric Menendez are cooling their heels. They've been in prison now for a long time. They committed a brutal act of violence, and they shotgun blasted their parents to death, and then went on to spend some of their parents' money and suggest after the killing, it was never thought that it could be them. After the killing, it was suggested it must have been a gangland hit. Their parents were in debt to the mob. There were a bunch of sort of mob-related phony narratives that were floated until it was Lyle and Eric that were ultimately realized to be the perpetrators. Now, in the I would suggest sort of revisionist way that you look back on many of these cases, there is a narrative that's been drawn out literally in a drama which dramatizes their case and who they are. And there is a renewed interest in this Menendez case, and even talk that they, as the, quote, victims of abuse, should be eligible for the freedom, for regaining their freedom. And I wonder if you can speak to this entire thing.
Well, it's hard to know where to begin. The case is really old. They've been in prison for 34 years. Both of them have been. It's gotten huge interest because of this Netflix show called Monsters. And on top of that, there's a documentary about it. And the two of them have gotten huge interest. I think it's the most popular show on Netflix, or was for a while. And of course, that's gotten a lot of people interested on social media. A lot of celebrities have gotten involved. Kim Kardashian visited them in prison and she put out a statement. Other people have gotten involved, but the rubber is kind of hitting the road because about a year ago, they made a motion for habeas corpus, which means you're wrongly holding us. And the idea is you're wrongly holding us because we have various remedies or to be released. And so they say one of them is that you didn't put on our, at the time it was derided as the abuse excuse at our second trial. But the rubber's really hitting the road because while that habeas corpus petition for relief was filed about a year ago down here in Los Angeles in state court, we have this huge race, which we talked about, I think, last week or the week before, between the incumbent, George Gascon, a famous progressive prosecutor down here, and he's got an opponent, a former assistant U.S. attorney from my office, Nathan Hochman, who said, you know, this has all gone too far and crime has taken over the city and it's all Gascon's fault. We've been Gasconed down here in LA, he says. And there's about 2 weeks left to go, and he's about 20 points behind in the polls, the incumbent progressive prosecutor is, to Hochman, who not only was an assistant U.S. attorney in my office, but went on to be a fairly high official in the George W. Bush administration. That a high W official is actually 20 points ahead for any office down here in Democratic Los Angeles is remarkable. But this issue of the Lyle and Eric Menendez brothers may become a sort of an October surprise, because what position is Gascon going to take on it? And it looks like he's going to be sympathetic to their claims. Now, their claims, Mark, are twofold. One is that they should be resentenced, and the DA has the power to join their motion that they be resentenced. And with the DA joining it, if he does, a judge might very well do it and say, look, even though you got life without parole, there are new circumstances, there's new information, and I'm going to make your sentence one where you could be released pretty promptly. The other one is that they have a retrial. In other words, there's all these allegations back and forth. There's this supposed new evidence. And I don't know how much you want to get into the weeds, but the new evidence is sort of interesting. One is that there was a boy band named Menudo. And one of the stars of Menudo says that when he was young, 14, 15, his manager, the person who could make and maintain his career, was this father, and that this father abused him. Now, that wasn't known at the time, I don't think, but if you believe that there was abuse going on, it's corroboration of the abuse. And then the other thing is that someone who's now dead had a letter. That letter has now been found. My understanding, though, is that that person at the time testified, or there was testimony, Mark, that one of the brothers had communicated to that friend that he was really worried about abuse, that he was being abused. It's a little bit vague, some of the letter, and he says that he can't stand it anymore. It's happening all the time, and his dad is, as I read the letter, overweight. So it's a little ambiguous. But supposedly it was known to the jury that there had been communication from that person. So whether there's actually a letter or not, or there was just communication at the time, in that sense, it was known that one of the boys had expressed at the time fear. And that's consistent with the abuse. So at the
I want to just stop you there for a second, because we had a DA from Orange County on. He had just written a book, The Book of Murder, it's called. He was a great guest. I think you may know him. But anyway, we asked him about the Menendez thing because it was just beginning to gurgle to the surface. It just happened a couple of weeks ago. And he became incensed almost that these allegations of abuse could even be dignified by the DA's office in any way investigated. His view was that these contemporaneous, this is what made me think of it, is the note that you're talking about, the letter that was sent that was, in a sense, hinting at the abuse. He said these contemporaneous type letters and emails, and these are oftentimes used by those who commit these awful murders. They, in a way, they sow the seeds for potential acquittal or excuses at the same time that they perpetrate these horrors. It was interesting to me to hear that from a prosecutor. Maybe you'll say, well, of course a prosecutor would say that, but it's also something that kind of did seem to make sense to me. Atlanta. He also said this, and then I'll, having given you this information, I want to hear your reaction. He said, the reports of abuse, he said, I just don't buy them. He said, I've been involved with over 1,000 cases of sexual abuse of teenagers and in families. And he said that Kitty Menendez would have been involved in it. He said, I've never seen that, where both parents would be involved with teenagers both being abused this way. He said, I just don't see. He said, give me this case in front of a jury and I'll convict them again. Now, was your reaction to that?
Well, first of all, I was an assistant U.S. attorney, and I'm very familiar with the idea that a person who would premeditate a crime would also premeditate a cover-up.
Thank you.
Or
Very well put. Yeah.
Or some excuse. And so, in this case, with the two of them, the prosecution narrative is that, of course, they went out and bought these guns. They went out and bought this ammunition. They plotted how they would get away with it. They were 18 and 21. Is it remarkable that they would also send a letter or tell somebody something that could be used as an excuse that I was being abused? And they indeed, and you can say that it's really not very corroborated at the time. One thing that's interesting about the political issue, and I do expect this to be an October surprise. I'd make my Katz that while the hearing's not until November 29th or so, I think that the incumbent progressive DA down here, Gascon, will make an announcement, maybe as early as the end of this week, but I think certainly by next week, that he's going to join their motion in some way or intervene and support their motion in some way. And that'll put the ball right back in the challenger's court, right? The former Bush official who may actually win down here. I think that he would probably join what Gascon is doing. And at that point, it would be kind of like a wedge issue, Mark, right? Because there'd be a lot of people like that prosecutor you spoke with who said, what? This is the law and order challenger? And he's also agreeing to this? Come on. And what else was interesting, Mark, was during their debate, the challenger kept saying, well, I'm a former prosecutor. You've never been a prosecutor. And then Gascon said, it's not about going into court and convicting people. It's about administering an enormous office. This job is to administer an enormous office, not to go down and be a great trial lawyer yourself. But of course, Gascon could turn around and say, you know what? Why don't we agree to a new trial? And Mr. Hochman, you go try them again. You go try them again. In terms of trying them again, let me just say this about the trials, because this has been portrayed in the shows. It's a multi-series show, and a lot of people have been sort of living this like almost they lived the OJ trial as it was happening. I mean, people are really into this case. And I'm not sure how close it is sometimes, because in the Monsters story, they tried to give all these different perspectives. One of them was someone has a perspective that's some incest between the two of them. That's not the main narrative. And they've said, this is rubbish. This is nonsense. They've even threatened to sue on account of that.
Yeah, the Menendez brothers did. You're talking about that.
Yes,
they threatened to sue. Yeah.
You might say, what's the damage to their reputation? They admit that, I mean, there's never been a question, not never, but, at the trials, there was never a question that they did it. It was just if they had this, as the judge termed it, abuse excuse. At the first trial, they had separate trials, Mark, and this goes way back. I was an assistant U.S. attorney with Adam Schiff in the office when this happened and when it first went to trial. And the first trial, 89, 90, something like that, they had separate trials, Mark, and each one had a hung jury. They said there was a gender split on the jury. And I guess the gender split meaning that women were more sympathetic to that defense, and men were like, are you kidding? You got shotguns, you killed your two parents, you killed your mother didn't even abuse you? Come on, what possible reason? Murder. The split at the separate trials, Mark, was some of them for murder, some of them for manslaughter. But they couldn't agree, 12 of them on either one, and so they had to have a retrial. At the retrial, that was not televised. This was 2 televised trials before we had the OJ spectacle, the OJ televised trial. At that one, the judge tried them both together, didn't have cameras, and they said they were entitled to something called imperfect self-defense, which is that they thought their parents were going to kill them. A reasonable person would not have thought their parents were going to kill them, but they had an unreasonable fear, and that unreasonable fear, honestly held, they said, honestly held, but unreasonable. A reasonable person wouldn't have had it, should knock it down to manslaughter. The judge looked at it and said, you know what, that's not a proper defense. So when you hear all these things that the abuse excuse wasn't allowed, it was in the context of not giving that instruction and allowing that imperfect self-defense. That, Mark, went up to the appeals court, and the appeals court in an unpublished decision said the judge hadn't made any error. One of the things the two brothers are up against is that they lost in the appeals court. They went to the California Supreme Court. The California Supreme Court wouldn't hear it. And then they also had a penalty phase after they were found guilty of murder. They had a penalty phase, Mark, whether it ought to be death or it ought to be life in prison without parole. The jury found in their favor. And at that hearing, that was only on penalty. At that hearing, they let everything in and the jury decided no death, but a life without parole. You could say even with all of that, Mark, it happened so long ago. Haven't they been rehabilitated in prison? And some of their argument is that they've simply been rehabilitated in prison and that all of this is really fascinating, what would happen in a new trial, all this history that I just told you. But at the end of the day, isn't 34 years enough? And that's what Gascon, the incumbent progressive prosecutor down here, has said. He's really indicated that he's going to that he's going to agree with that they paid. He said, and we're looking at morally and ethically, haven't they paid their debt to society? If he's talking like that, it seems very clear that he's going to join the request. And then other people have said, what should they do?
Well, they shotgunned their parents' faces off. You tell me, was that 34 years enough? I mean, I mean, again, repeatedly, it wasn't just that, but they went back. They doubled back to
Mark, the amazing part of the story is they then went about spending their parents' fortunes. And the argument from the prosecution point of view is the reason that they killed the mother had nothing to do with abuse. It had nothing to do that she silently didn't do anything about the abuse or she acquiesced in the abuse. It was that she was utterly blameless, but she would have inherited the money, not them. And they wanted the money. So they had to kill the mom too and get the money. They went on a huge spending spree. And that ended up being the huge evidence against them that they went on this huge spending spree, bought loads and loads of money. It turns out they had life insurance too. They spent some of it on very expensive lawyers. That's a whole other story in the case, the expensive lawyers that they had, because as I said, they went through those trials. And then another fascinating part of the story, if I can just mention this for 1 minute, is that one of them went to a psychiatrist and told the psychiatrist, and this is totally covered by the privilege, this never should have been revealed. The psychiatrist broke privilege, told it to his girlfriend, and his story was that he told it to his girlfriend because he was worried that if they'd murdered their parents in such a cruel, awful way, as you just said, maybe they'd come and murder him now that he knew their secret. He wanted somebody to be a witness. That was his story. He had no right to reveal it to her. After they broke up, Mark, shocking, your viewers will be stunned. She suddenly realized that she needed to tell that to the authorities. And so she told that to the authorities. That was their first huge lead. Now, you could say it's improper, it's fruit of the poisonous tree, but it's a rare judge that's going to suppress a murder case because it's fruit of the poisonous tree. Then they went and they looked at the spending records and they saw how much money they were all spending. A lot of these people are still alive. This psychiatrist, I think, therapist had to give up his license, but he's still out there. You know, as part of this whole inquiry, the fascination with this case, they've gone and see, is this lawyer still alive? Is this judge still alive? Is this famous witness from the case still alive? But my prediction, Mark, and people are really, really talking about this, and I'm sure some people will have a lot more detail. I couldn't get into all of it, but I do think that the incumbent DA down here is going to make a last-minute issue of this, and I expect the challenger will say, number one, he made a last-minute issue of this. It's an October surprise, but at the end of the day, the challenger will have to take a position on this, and I think it's going to be very hard. If he denies, if he says, no, if he says, I don't know what I'm going to do, they're going to say, no, decide. You want this job as DA, make a decision. If he makes a decision that they ought to get resentenced or they ought to get retried, people will say, what? Come on, this has been decided by the appeals court over and over again. There's nothing really new in that period of time. They got life without parole. Life without parole means life without parole. They could have gotten death. That was the jury's decision, to give them mercy and life without parole.
So your prediction is that the DA is going to make an announcement, or is your prediction what the announcement's going to be?
No, I think that he's going to make an announcement, and I think the announcement is going to be, I think it's too fraught to say they ought to get a new trial. That's
So you think he'll pass on a new trial for them?
I think he'll pass on a new trial, Mark, and I think he'll say that he does join the request that they be resentenced. They've spent long enough in jail. There's evidence of rehabilitation. There's some new evidence. Let's give them a second chance at life, even if they did something so awful as that. And that will put the challenger in the position if he says no, if he says what your prosecutor says, if he says, look, I'm the law and order candidate. Okay, that's been the problem. People have gotten too many breaks in this city. And these people now are getting another break from our DA, who always wants to give people a break. He's the DA. He's not supposed to always want to give people a break. No. If he says that, people will think he's very unsympathetic, because there's a lot of sympathy now for the two of them to be released. And if he says, yes, I agree to release them, he's got this enormous amount of money from the police unions. He's running with the money. The challenger is from the police unions. Same old story.
You think the challenger is going to weigh? Hochman's going to weigh in and say he thinks that they should be released? Is that your prediction as well?
I think that I think that he's going to say, he's going to mealy mouth it. I think he's going to mealy mouth it. Yes, Mark, but I think that he's going to say they should certainly look at it. They should have sympathy for them.
I mean, if it's a pure political play, I don't see how that's politically expedient, because I get it. It's a Netflix show. It's getting a lot of buzz. I don't know. I'm sure there's polling and internal polling he has on where the electorate is. But is that a political winner for him to all of a sudden, jump on the Menendez case and suggest that they be freed?
I'm not a political commentator, but I think, first of all, I think that Gascon's going to do it because he's 20 points behind in the polls. And
I get it. Gascon's got nothing to lose, but what about Hochman? I don't get it.
It's a hard call for him, Mark. So you think that he's going to, more about politics than I do, Mark. You've been watching this for a long time, commenting on it for a long time. I'm a legal commentator. But I just think the point is, if he says, no, I'm not for this at all, there's an awful lot of sympathy for them. Especially, there's a younger brother too. He's the one who wrote the letter about abuse. It's newly discovered evidence.
Maybe there's a lot.
Mark, one last thing. The family, you got to remember, it's the same family. So the overwhelming majority of family members, victims' family members in this case, are for them getting a break. They held this huge press conference, and their own family is the family of the two victims are for these particular perpetrators getting a break. It's rather a fraught issue, and I think it's all we're going to see what happens soon enough, Mark. But I think
it's tricky. I mean, normally I'd say let sleeping dogs lie, but the dogs aren't so sleeping anymore. Here's Cheryl saying, I've listened to tons of testimony, and every member of the family supported this abuse. Two things can be possible. I initially thought just as you do. So she believes the abuse, and she also feels, it sounds like that should be, admissible and perhaps a hook on which to hang some sort of new freedom for the Menendez brothers on. I've got to move on because I only have you for another minute, and I really wanted to get to the other
Mark, one last thing. I think Hochman's going to Hochman from my old office, I think, is going to look heartless unless he plays this one just right. I think it's a little fraught for him, and I'll be interested to see what he does. He's a capable, talented person, Hochman. I know him from the U.S. Attorney's Office.
I think Gascon is going down. So I don't see any percentage, particularly politically, in taking any chances. But as you may have suggested here, it's less of a chance to come in on the side of Menendez's freedom than it is to kind of keep them incarcerated. Maybe that's true. I don't know. It seems to me, again, like, don't touch anything. You're going to win. Gascon is going to lose. I would say to Hochman, just leave everything alone.
Gascon will make him touch it. Gascon will make him touch it because he'll make his announcement, and everyone will turn to Hochman and say, what's your position? We want to know what you think. And the victims, the victim's family is also the perpetrator's family, and therefore release. Victims' rights.
I get it. I mean, and that's one of the things that I will deal with on day one when I become district attorney, is what I would say. All right. The former president, Donald Trump, I want to quickly finish with this, David Katz. This summer, apparently, this is breaking news. This is a big story. Last night it was broken. Trump offered a financial incentive to adult film star Stormy Daniels if she agreed to keep quiet about Trump, including about the relationship that became the center, of course, of the hush money payments that ended up with the New York criminal trial. Daniels it was offered essentially a deal that would take off of her bottom line that she owed the Trump people, if you want to think it this way, because she had a judgment against her for hundreds of thousands of dollars. She was offered to take something off of that money that was owed if she would sign a document that would essentially bind her to no longer speaking about Trump in any forum. So this is, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, the exact thing that got him into trouble the last time, which is paying money, but and again, it's not the hush money payment that I think you can pay hush money. It's not even illegal. But the idea somehow that you fold it into this other thing, which is the settlement for your court case and the agreement that the court is handling, that's the illegal part, I think. But that's why you're here. Tell me what's illegal and tell me how this all washes down.
Well, it's ironic, of course, because he got in so much trouble over something that has the same sort of bad smell. But I think this one's not illegal because what he got prosecuted for in New York was falsifying the business records, showing that it was something other than what it was. Here, I guess they were going to show it for what it was. She wanted she wanted to pay only $620,000. They wanted her to pay $650 or $660. They said, we'll settle at your price. We'll settle at $620, Stormy, but you have to sign here this non-disclosure agreement. So it was, liable to blow up in the press and have Rachel Maddow and you and a lot of other people lampoon Trump once again, trying to pay off Stormy Daniels, give her some money to shut up. But it's hush money in the sort of like comedian sense. It's not that manufacturing false records, reporting false records like what he did in that case. The people may wonder, what on earth does she owe him money for? But at the time, she had Michael Avenatti, I believe, as her attorney still. He's in prison, serving a term right now. But at that time, I guess they sued Trump for something, and the court found that there was no proper basis for it. And if you file a lawsuit without doing proper legal and factual research or on frivolous grounds. Now, people think, well, Trump does this all the time, but Trump has huge amounts of lawyers to fight it off when you say, hey, it was frivolous, you ought to be sanctioned. Apparently, this lawsuit didn't end well either for her or Avenatti. Some judge said, look, this wasn't all your lawyer's fault. You, Stormy Daniels, should have investigated more. You shouldn't have made what the judge found were frivolous claims. So we're sanctioning you, not just the lawyer, Avenatti, but we're sanctioning you. And at some point, she had a GoFundMe, and she figured she'd just pay the $600,000 instead of beating it to death. She doesn't have the money to beat it to death, and she wants to start a new career and a new life for herself.
Right, exactly. That's a great summary of how we got to this moment. And for those who wonder how she could be on the hook for anything, go back and listen to what David just said. That's exactly right. And so based on everything I've read as well. And so it's odd how this works, but it's something distinctly different than the hush money trial. Even though that hush money was all about Stormy Daniels, the Stormy Daniels judgment came out of a defamation case. So it's interesting. David, I love our time together and so grateful for your thoughts on the Menendez thing. It is kind of a both renewed interest and maybe a lot of relevance in this DA race, which as you suggest, they may have to weigh in on both sides soon. And of course, the Trump stuff in the Georgia voting case is so very critical. So we look forward to more. You can find David Katz across the English-speaking world, I say, on British radio and London Morning Drive. David Katz joins us from Los Angeles. I love the way they say Los Angeles when they bring you on. Los Angeles. But it's a great pleasure and an honor, pal. Love having you in. Thanks so much.
That's how they pronounce it in the UK. People should also look in on News Nation on Saturday or Sunday around 4 or 5 o'clock. I'm on there most weekends, and I wish I were up there in San Francisco with you. It sounds like a beautiful setting.
It is indeed. It's great weather, and this SF Fall show is really something special. Yeah, News Nation, you class up the joint. Good to see you on there. All right. See you, David Katz.
We have promo. And,
we do. We're all FOMO. See you, pal. Thank you. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.